get the most out of this video, listen to the introduction to understand what is going to happen astrologically this week and when it will occur, then use the timestamps in the description box or comments section below to go to your sun, moon and rising signs to see how things will generally affect you. This is a general read of the astrological energies that will be playing out this week. For a specific assessment of how the planetary energies will affect you personally, I would suggest getting a reading with a professional astrologer. You can do so with me through the Guiding Star Astrology website. If you're new to astrology, you are so welcome on this platform. If you would like to learn to read your own astrology chart, you can do a short, fun course with me for $35 Australian. The link is in the description below. Thank you to all my YouTube subscribers and my Patreon family members. Without you, this video and its message would not be possible. Hello, I'm Kesenya and welcome to this series that I've been preparing for you all about Neptune and Neptune's transits through every house in the horoscope and how it will affect your life. Now, I've been wanting to do this series for quite some time now. However, I decided I'd wait until Neptune had crossed my ascendant and my first house lord. In doing so, there's a strategy behind this. I wanted to see how Neptune would play out in my life on those very significant and key points in my chart. Astrology is 50% reading books and doing courses and getting mentors and teachers, and the other 50% is observation and experience of the planets in your life. So the older you get, the more wisdom, the more knowledge that you will have about how planets impact us. So now that I've gone through those particular transits of Neptune in my first house, I feel that I'm ready to talk more in depth about this very watery planet. So let's start by having a look at what Neptune is all about astronomically. So Neptune comes after Uranus in the order of the planets. We have Mercury, Venus, the Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, boom, Neptune. Second to last of the key players in astrology. Pluto is still considered to be a planet of influence in astrological circles, and therefore Neptune is the second last. Now, when Neptune was discovered, it wasn't through observation. They didn't sort of spot Neptune in the sky and go, aha, there it is, because you actually need a telescope to see Neptune. It's not something you can observe with the naked eye. And so Neptune was discovered through mathematics. Basically, the astrologers of the time when Neptune was discovered, and we're going to talk about that when Neptune was discovered in just a minute, but the astrologers of the time were observing Uranus, and they had mathematically predicted where Uranus was going to go according to all their observations, and then Uranus did his usual quirky thing and did not follow the predicted orbit. And so from that, they were able to calculate that there must be a planet further out that's pulling on Neptune, and its gravitational force has caused it to move in a different way than we expected or anticipated. And so because of their mathematical calculations, they began to look for another planet beyond Uranus. And voila, we have Neptune. Now, what is very interesting, and this is quite telling about the character of Neptune actually as well, what is very interesting is that Galileo had observed Neptune back in 1612. He didn't realize that Neptune was a planet. I don't know what he thought it was, but he didn't sort of put two and two together and think, there's another planet out there. So Galileo had observed Neptune, and this was a whole 234 years before the discovery of Neptune. Now, why I say this correlates to sort of the ambiguous nature of Neptune is that he's a bit slippery as a planet. It's hard to sort of pin down. So here was Galileo observing Neptune, not realizing what he was, not sort of seeing it for what it was, basically sort of under an illusion that Neptune was something else. That is a very Neptunian quality, which we'll talk about very soon. But 234 years later, we had the discovery of Neptune in the real through that mathematical observation that I was talking about. This was in 1846. Now, most people know that when we discover new planets, there is often a rise in consciousness or an increase in conscious awareness in humanity on the Earth at the time of the discovery of a new planet. For example, when Uranus was discovered, we had a number of revolutions occurring around the world. What does Uranus correlate to? It correlates to freedom, liberation, equality, and equal distribution of resources. And what were these revolutions about all around the world? Well, namely, the French Revolution was occurring when Uranus was discovered. And that was about no more let them eat cake kind of stuff, no more of the aristocracy living in opulent luxury beyond compare, while the poor people of the land went hungry and could barely clothe and feed themselves. And of course, Uranus, sorry to diverge off Neptune, but Uranus is all about those things, equality. And so the conscious awareness of the planet had reached a point where it was like, no, now hang on, we're not going to take this inequality anymore. We want things to be fairer. We want things to be more even. And lo and behold, at the discovery of Uranus, which rules those things, the consciousness was ripe and ready to embrace that as part of its awareness. Now, the same occurs with Neptune, who was discovered a little while after, as I said, in 1846. So what was the expansion of consciousness that occurred at the time Neptune was discovered? Well, we had an invention of photography that had occurred sort of 20 years before. Now, when we're talking about these big planetary discoveries, this is no mediocre discovery. This is really kick-ass stuff. And so we look at the surrounding sort of, 20, 30 years as an era of the discovery of Neptune. Keep in mind, when I'm talking about this, that up until the discovery of Uranus in the late 1700s, there had the existence of planets beyond what you could see with the naked eye was not known, was not proven. And so for thousands of years, the consciousness of humanity had been in a state where it was only aware of what it could see, touch, taste, hear, and smell. In the real, in the earthly dimension. If you couldn't see beyond Saturn, then there were no planets beyond Saturn. And then all of a sudden, at the discovery of Uranus, boom, we have an awareness of more. And so Uranus was discovered, and then Neptune was discovered. And so the surrounding sort of 30 odd years in the vicinity of 1846 when Neptune was discovered are Neptunian times. And so we look at what was unfolding in consciousness then. And as I've just said a moment ago, photography. Photography was discovered. Neptune rules photography. Motion pictures were discovered 30 years or so after the discovery of Neptune. And Neptune rules motion pictures. The spiritualist movements were unfolding around the world. We started to find people who were interested in sort of hypnosis and mesmerism, people who would be, looking at channeling, people who wanted to conduct seances. These sorts of things started to come into vogue as parlor games, as did the tarot card readings and even astrological readings as sort of, like I said, parlor games, entertainment at fancy people's dinner parties and so on. That was the very glamorous side of Neptunian times, using those spiritualist things as entertainments for glamorous people. Plastics were discovered around this time. Braille for the blind, writing for the blind. Antiseptics. Pasteurization was discovered and started to be used. And these are just a few of the advancements that occurred in society around the time that Neptune was discovered. We also had cultural movements like Romanticism, the poets, Byron and Shelley around this time as well. We had, alongside Byron and Shelley, we had things like the Frankenstein novel or the Dracula novel, which is a very interesting thing. Impressionism was also the painting style en vogue around this era of history. And we also had the Communist Manifesto that was written. Now, some people, if you're not familiar with politics, the name communism can conjure up all sorts of negative imagery in your head. But the idea behind communism was a bit like Uranus in that it was about equality and compassion to everybody. So these are combinations of both Uranian themes, which is equality, and sort of an even playing field for everybody. And also Neptune, which is highly compassionate, wanting everybody to get an opportunity. And of course, Neptune, for those who we haven't got to this point yet, but Neptune rules idealism as well. So the ideal of the Communist Manifesto was present in these Neptunian times as well. Whether it actually functioned and worked was another matter, but the ideal was there. A utopian vision for society is what Neptune is all about, and so there's no surprise that we had movements in that direction towards that ideal at this time. Back to the astronomy, Neptune is a planet that's made up of liquid and ice. And it's also full of different gases as well. So it's quite a combination, Neptune, of many things. But it's very similar in its size and its structure to its nearest planet, which is Uranus. They're almost twin-like in many senses, even though they function very differently astrologically. Like Uranus, Neptune is actually circled by some very faint rings of dust. Uranus's rings are more visible, but Neptune does have rings as well. Very light, very faint rings around Neptune. If you've seen images of Neptune that were taken, I think it was by the Voyager space probe. I may be wrong there, but if memory serves me, I think it was Voyager that took images of Neptune. You'll know that it's this beautiful, serene, blue-looking planet that has some wafting sort of white, they look like clouds, around it occasionally. And despite its very serene-looking surface, it is quite a wild planet underneath. So again, that illusionary factor there. On the surface, it looks like it's cool, calm, collected, and underneath, it's not what it seems. On Neptune, winds whip around the planet at, I have to read this, 2,100 kilometers an hour, and they're furious winds. Not only that, Neptune takes only 16 hours to do a rotation. It's heaps bigger than Earth, Neptune, lots bigger than Earth. And we take 24 hours as an Earth to rotate. But if you're a monstrous sized planet and you're spinning, doing a circuit of 16 hours, then the gravitational pull of Neptune becomes pretty phenomenal, despite the fact that you're mostly made up of gas. So this momentum of the gravitational force from the spin and the winds that whip around Neptune sort of whips up all the ice, methane, hydrogen, helium, and ammonia. Had to read that list to make sure I got the chemicals right. Whips it all up into a big slushy mess. So it's not this pure ethereal kind of atmosphere or body of Neptune. It's actually a bit of a slushy, wild mess when you get down to it. Now, some scientists, and this is very interesting, some scientists have hypothesized, just through their calculations and observations, that the core of Neptune, which is burning iron, very fiery, very hot core, they have hypothesized that there is a layer of diamond, liquid diamond, that encircles the core of Neptune. Now, just how they've reached that conclusion, don't ask me, but it is there in scientific journals that this is a hypothesis that could prove true and correct. Now, this iron core that's burning hot, white hot iron core, is actually bigger than the Earth. So the core, the solid mass, if you like, of Neptune is larger than the Earth, and it burns at about, or its temperature is about 5,000 degrees Celsius. So it's incredibly hot, even though it's so far from the sun and distant from the sun's rays, which is usually where heat comes from in the solar system. This Neptune has its own heat source through this burning iron core. So you're getting the picture? We have this impression of Neptune, of serenity on the outside astronomically, but not quite what it seems deep down. And again, we'll see that represented when we start talking about the astrology of Neptune and how it impacts us, and therefore how it's going to impact us when it travels through each house. We also can see that it is a very fluid type planet. It's, slushy, slippery, and of course Neptune rules the watery depths of the ocean, if you're familiar with mythology and the title of Neptune. We'll talk about that in just a second as well. I love the analogy that we're seeing here of this watery fluid planet, but it has a solidness at the core and a preciousness, the liquid diamond. There's something precious at the core of Neptune. Now, Neptune, as we've already stated, is invisible. You cannot see Neptune out on a fine stargazing night. You will always need a telescope to see Neptune. And as the old Hermetic principle goes, as above, so below. The way things appear in the sky from our vantage point on Earth is exactly how they will play out and be represented and reflected in our lives on the planet. What does that mean? Well, it means that the planets we can see with the naked eye, the visible planets, in astrology, they correlate and connect to what we experience visibly, tangibly, experientially on the Earth. Our touch, taste, sight, sound, and smell. You know, the physical things of the experience of being a body incarnate on the Earth connect to visible planets and what they rule. When you get to Neptune, actually when you get to Uranus, Neptune and Pluto, they're all invisible without a telescope, and therefore they connect to the inner realm of the psyche, what motivates us unconsciously, you know, our behavioral patterns, our things we can't help about ourselves, you know, our deep psychological wounds and our karmas that we carry with us at the core of our self, at our soul level. They correspond to these invisible planets because as above, so below. We can't see them, therefore it's like the part of the iceberg that sits underneath the water. You can't see it, but it's still there packing a whopping punch, especially if you happen to be on the Titanic. So Neptune has at least 14 moons that circle it. It has a greater and denser gravity than the Earth. So if you're standing on Neptune, you will weigh a lot more than you do on the Earth. And it takes longer than one lifetime for Neptune to circle the sun. It takes 165 years. So in your lifetime, you will never see Neptune return to its natal place in your astrological chart. You just won't live that long, at least not in this day and age as I'm recording this video. Who knows what science might do in the future, but right now you won't live to be 165 and see Neptune come back to its natal position. Let's explore Neptune mythologically now. Well, Neptune is the name of the Roman god of the sea. Not only the sea though, in the oceans, but also of fresh water. Neptune was the Roman god of fresh water as well. And we often see Neptune in mythological pictorial representation with his trident. And of course, what is the symbol of Neptune astrologically? It's a trident. So there we go. There's so much correlation between the mythologies and what plays out in the skies again here. So again, there's no coincidences that when the astronomers discovered Neptune, they didn't know that it was made mostly of liquid and gas. They didn't know it was mostly a fluid planet. But lo and behold, here we are. They gave it the name Neptune, king of the oceans, and Neptune is quite an oceanic planet with its liquid mass. Once again, this is showing us how the conscious awareness works, even in unconscious ways. Now, a little bit more about Neptune mythologically was that he was the son of the Titan god Saturn. Now, along with Neptune, there was Jupiter and there was Pluto that were the sons of Saturn. And Jupiter, Neptune, Pluto didn't really get along with Saturn very well. If you're familiar with the mythology of Saturn and Jupiter, you'll know that the mother of Jupiter hid him away because Saturn had a habit of eating his children lest they rise up against him and take over. So theoretically, in the mythology, Neptune and Pluto were gobbled up by their father Saturn. But then along came Jupiter when he was all grown up to the rescue, and Saturn regurgitated his offspring, Neptune and Pluto. There were others as well, but the main ones were Neptune and Pluto, the brothers of Jupiter. And together, Jupiter, Neptune and Pluto overthrew their father Saturn, and Jupiter became king of the gods. And we had the reign of the Olympian gods from that point on, which include Neptune and Pluto. So Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto are the Olympian gods. Saturn was the Titan god. And Uranus, who was the father of Saturn, just to confuse matters even further, was not a Titan and not an Olympian. He was sort of one of the forefathers of them all. In ancient Greece and Rome, they celebrated the role of water in their lives, and they had a festival to celebrate this, and it was known as Neptunalia. There was also another festival that occurred at the similar time called Ferinalia. I won't go into the mythology of that name, but they were both celebrated around the same time. So July 23rd and July 25th, the role of water and the preciousness of water in life was celebrated with these festivals. So Neptunalia, it was a time of honoring the god Neptune and its watery association. So let's take a peek at the astrology of Neptune. I'm going to tell you all about Neptune astrologically. What is Neptune about? Well, as we've already come across, Neptune is about illusion, seeing something and actually realizing it's something else. It's not what it seems. So that can be a number of things can be displayed that way. Glamour is ruled by Neptune, because if you're glamorous, you've got amazing makeup and hair and beautiful, shimmering, gorgeous clothes and stuff. You look very glamorous, but is that who you really are? When you wake up in bed in the morning, and your hair's a tousled mess and you haven't got makeup on and you're wearing your baggy old t-shirt, you might not look glamorous. So glamour is ruled by Neptune because it's part of that deception, if you like, but not a bad deception. It's just a deception. It's not what it seems. Neptune, in that sense, rules glamour. Neptune, as we've already discussed, rules a desire to return to utopia, to achieve utopia, to create heaven on earth, so to speak. So that can be a very positive thing if we're wanting to make the world a better place. And Neptune is also quite a compassionate planet. There is a lot of unconditional love that goes along with Neptune, brotherly love, the idea of anyone can be saved from their horrible life or their difficulties or their own ill choices in life. Neptune has this sort of unconditional love. Some might refer to that as this redeemer quality about it. And Neptune can be connected to miracles as well, because if somebody is raised up from the muck and mire into a wonderful life, well, that is often seen as a miracle. And that transformation that occurs is a very Neptunian associated thing in astrology. Part of this desire for utopia can actually have connections to a longing to escape the horror and the harshness of earthly reality. And those of us who are very Neptunian, who have a strong Neptune in our chart, or even a strong 12th house or a strong Pisces, will know what this is all about. The wanting to escape from earth and earth realities because they're too hard to bear. They're fearful. Earth is a fearful place for these highly sensitive Neptunian, Piscean, 12th house souls, and it's almost too hard. So Neptune is also associated with tremendous longing to tap out, to escape, a longing to go to heaven. Now, you'll see a lot of religious groups, fanatical religious groups going down this road where it doesn't matter what I endure in this lifetime, I will be rewarded when I go to heaven. And that's all they're living for. They don't even engage in earthly reality and earthly life because it's only about heaven and getting to heaven after this horrible life is over. That's a Neptunian thing. Also, Neptune has this idea about it of wanting to return to the watery depths, i.e. the womb, being in the embryonic fluid, being safe and secure, not having to sort of struggle and make it on our own because, hey, we've got everything we need. We're warm, we're safe, we're fed, we're in the womb. And Neptune has this desire for that too. So it's a dual desire for paradise, heaven, but also at the same time a desire to, return to the safety and security of home, so to speak. Neptune can also give a longing to be saved. You want your hero to come along and rescue you from this, terrible existence. That's a Neptunian longing. But also, if we find that we desire to be the rescuer, we want to be somebody's hero, that's a Neptunian thing as well. So there's often a spiritual connection with Neptune, and I'm sure from what I've just described, you can see connections in religious circles to savior mentality, redeemer qualities, longing for paradise. You can see where Neptune's getting its sort of shadow side of spirituality popping up there in religious, ideology. But Neptune is also in the positive side which I love to talk about more, is the beautiful connection to angelic realms, to the divine. So if we channel higher wisdom, higher knowledge, that's a Neptune thing. If we're channeling creativity, beauty, art, if we're channeling unconditional love. And now I'm talking about channeling here, not in the sort of, some entity speaking through me, although that is a Neptunian thing. I'm talking about simply expressing things that come from beyond us. Beautiful things, gracious things, ethereal things, things that come from beyond the earthly plane. That spiritual side of Neptune is so beautiful. So Neptune is the manifestation of divine love, divine grace, and divine creativity, divine creative ideals. He is connected to visualization, imagination, and even healing through visualization and imagination. The idea that through your thought processes and lifting them to a higher plane, dreaming and aspiring of what it could be, that you can heal yourself. And again, we come back to the miraculous component here, where people are miraculously healed. Neptune has connections to hypnosis as well, and mesmerism. In fact, Mesmer was the man who developed the idea of being hypnotized as a form of healing. So the two are very similar. And so Neptune has connections with this as well. It's all very interesting, but Neptune is actually a planet that it's hard to define him, and I use the word him loosely, as a masculine planet. Now, Neptune as a god was a masculine god, but the expression of Neptune is actually very feminine. It errs on the feminine side. So it would be very interesting to understand exactly how they reached the concept in ancient mythology that Neptune, the god of the oceans, was actually a man. I feel maybe that came about at the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans, when the patriarchy was establishing itself, because really the expression of Neptune is this compassionate, unconditionally loving, highly creative energy, which connects more to the water signs and the watery energy, which is feminine in astrology. So very interesting there. Neptune is a more feminine energy expression. Neptune rules the sign of Pisces in modern astrology, and of course that is a water sign as well. Neptune is also in astrology neither benefic nor malefic. So that means, we don't put a label of good or bad on him. But really with Neptune, it depends what aspects you have to your placement of Neptune in the chart, whether he will manifest his shadow side or whether he will manifest his light side in your life. And we've kind of talked a little bit about both here now. I will talk further about the shadow side in just a second. But if you have mostly good aspects, like a conjunction, we can classify that as a good aspect, or perhaps a trine or a sextile to Neptune from other planets, then it's looking good for you. Neptune will tend to express in its more angelic form. It's more miraculous, blessed form. But if you have quite a mixed bag, maybe you've got some squares to your Neptune, maybe you've got some oppositions to your Neptune. If that's what it's looking like, then you may end up with a bit more of the shadow side exhibiting in your personality or what you attract in your life. Let's explore what that is all about. Well, some of the shadow side of Neptune is in the desire for utopia. We want to see evil people punished. And you'll see this a lot expressing in religions, where we just want everyone who's bad to go to hell. And that's actually a shadow Neptunian energy, because we want to preserve utopia for the pure, and everyone else can suffer, So that's a shadow side expression of Neptune. Narcissism can be connected with Neptune's shadow side as well. And so can masochism, actually. If we think about this desire to be seen as holy and pure, often that connects to making ourselves falsely humble and lower than another person. And that can incite in another person distaste, and disgust for another person who is falsely humble. And of course, if you're familiar with the idea of masochism, then you know that it's about debasing yourself in order that you might feel more worthy or more holy because you've made yourself lowly. It's a very slippery, shall we say, concept. And again, not everything is as it seems. It might seem with someone who is in a masochist state that they don't care about themselves, that they don't love themselves, that they're being cruel to themselves. But very often under the surface is this energy of wanting, the best way I can describe it, to be pure through making yourself lowly, like the flagellants did in ancient medieval times through whipping themselves. Oh, they're so pure and holy because they're whipping themselves for Christ. It's that kind of idea. Odd one, but not everything is as it seems with Neptune and Neptune's shadow side. Projection is something that is actually a Neptunian behavioral quality coming from this psychological depth. If we have separation anxiety, that's a shadow side of Neptune. Of course it is, because we are longing to return to the womb. And when we're separate from that safe space, separation anxiety. So if you're looking at those psychological issues in a chart and, assessing that, look at Neptune and what Neptune's doing in the chart. Shadow side of Neptune can be idealization, where we don't see a person clearly for who they are, but we put them on a pedestal. So celebrity culture would be one expression of that. Anyone we put on a pedestal and hold up there, and we create an illusion around that person. It's not the truth. It's not real. It's not what is really going on at the core of a person, to have them up on a pedestal and think that, oh my God, they're so perfect. That's idealization, and that's Neptune shadow side, as is hysteria, as is addiction. Addiction's another expression here. And why? Because addiction is escapism. If we're addicted to drugs, usually with Neptune involved, it's because we want to get away from the harshness of reality. If we're addicted to alcohol, again, it's an escape mechanism and it's an escape valve, but not a healthy one, because reality is too harsh and we just long to get out of here. Obviously, deception is a shadow side of Neptune, because if you're creating an illusion, while there can be sort of times when that's good, as in the case of glamour and that's fun and what have you, sometimes when we are creating an illusion, we're deceiving others. We're pulling the wool over their eyes. We're not being our true self, and that is a shadow Neptune expression. Sacrifice, I would say, is a shadow Neptunian expression. Again, it comes in close context with this false humility kind of behavior. If we feel that we have to sacrifice ourselves for another person, then we're kind of making ourselves to be better than the other person. I'll go in, I'll sacrifice myself, and then that person will be saved. And there's a false humility about it, a deceptive humility that goes along with that. And of course, oftentimes when people have strong Neptune representations in the chart, they lose themselves, they martyr themselves for the sake of another. Does that benefit their life? No, usually. But it might make them feel spiritually greater, or that they have been a noble person. Again, we've got this sacrifice energy that's a bit not what it seems, and this is also the shadow side of Neptune. Victimization. Victimization is another Neptunian energy, where poor me, I am suffering because life has been unkind, and therefore I am longing to get away from life, and return to the womb or go to paradise because I have been victimized. Instead of being our own savior, instead of making the best of things and doing what we can to transform our karma, no, we're a victim and we just want to escape. That's so Neptunian shadow side. Especially, you could call it suffering that's seen as purity. So these are some of the Neptunian shadow energies. I don't want to leave it on that though. There are good things, obviously, that Neptune correlates to. We've talked about some of these, but, others might be the belief that there is enough for everybody, and that the universe can be kind and the universe has our back. In fact, transcendence of matter is a very big Neptunian theme. The belief that eventually good will win over evil. That's Neptunian as well. Jesus' teachings were very Neptunian. He was, after all, the avatar for the age of Pisces, which was ruled by Neptune. So compassion, unconditional love. We've talked about that. Forgiveness, healing, all these things, divine healing, miraculous healing. These are Neptunian ruled things. So Jesus was a big representation of Neptune energy in the positive. The most creative and artistic planet, we've already talked about that. And it's actually at its strongest capacity in water signs. So Neptune does very well in Pisces, Cancer, or Scorpio. She will tend to give the best results if that's where he is in your natal chart, but also if that's where he's transiting at any given time, he's going to give the better side of himself to you. Neptune rules the color light blue. Hence, I have my blue blouse on here today for this video, but I've also worn my very well, you might not be able to see it because the color in this camera doesn't actually come up that good. I need to get a new camera, but it's actually a very beautiful velvet jacket that's ocean color, like the kind of tranquil turquoise that we see up on the beaches of Queensland or some beautiful tropical beaches. And I thought, seeing as Neptune rules these gorgeous oceans, I would wear my beautiful aqua turquoise color velvet jacket with my light blue Neptunian top. Neptune can also have connections to lavender, purpley colors also. Hence, we see often people who work in spiritual, sort of new agey fields have a lot of purple going on, because often they might not be aware of this even, but they're probably highly Neptunian people. They have a strong Neptune in their chart, and so the purple element tends to come through quite a lot, and you'll see a lot of, websites and stuff with purple this and lavender that on many spiritual sites. Neptune rules the gemstone amethyst as well, and so amethyst has a lot of qualities to it that correlate very strongly to Neptune. Some tangible things, and I did say in the beginning Neptune's more psychological. Yep, that's true, very true, but Neptune does have some governance of certain items on the planet, namely because of what was happening at the time Neptune was discovered, what things were starting to be used and utilized when Neptune was discovered, and therefore Neptune gets the rulership of those things. So the ocean, obviously, but oils, plastics, impressionism, film, photography, advertising, poisons, escapism, that's not actually a tangible thing, but that's obviously something Neptune rules, drugs. As I've already illustrated, a lot of these things were being discovered. Film, photography, medications, the shipping industry, steam-powered ships were really starting to get a Guernsey around the time that Neptune came along. So shipping and the oceans, all of these things, highly Neptunian. Now, in my level 1 astrology course that is coming out, you can learn more about Neptune and the things Neptune rules, and we go into greater depth with Neptune there and its rulerships. So if you're interested in knowing more, check out that course. But what does Neptune want? It wants unwavering trust, unwavering love, an unwavering belief that the divine will come through for you. Even in the face of no evidence at all, Neptune wants us to believe. If you are 40 odd years old and you've never had a boyfriend, Neptune is saying, keep believing and the miracle can happen. And I would encourage you, if that's the case, well, wait till you're 42. Who knows? Neptune, when it reaches its maturation at 42, may just bring you what you've been waiting for. So that's a short look at the beautiful and quite intriguing and unusual planet of Neptune. Now let's have a look at what Neptune is all about when he travels through a house in the horoscope and what he's going to do for you while he's there. So how do we find out if Neptune is transiting through our 8th house? Well, we need to begin by finding out where Neptune is currently transiting in the sky, and you might like to do that through going to an app like planetwatcher.com, which will show you where Neptune is. Look for the little trident symbol, find out what sign it's in. These are the sign symbols here around the center of the astro wheel. Find out what sign it's in, and when you know, then we need to find out where that falls in your chart. And if we're looking at the 8th house, you're going to need to count and see if Neptune's transiting position is 8 houses from your rising sign. This is using whole sign astrology. Now we're using Pisces Neptune. Here is Neptune in Pisces for this example. And if we were looking at 8 houses from the rising sign, in this example, that would mean the rising sign is Leo. The reason that is, let me show you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 houses from the rising sign. And so Neptune in this example in Pisces is transiting the 8th house for Leo people. Now the 8th house has to do with death and rebirth. It has to do with regeneration, transformation, crisis, other people's money, sexuality, and the unknown levels of our psyche. So there's a lot of topics to cover in 8th house realms. It's a very deep and intense placement in the chart. So let's try and explore some of these things. It is a very difficult 14-year transit, I have to point out from the get-go, but it's also a transit that promises some big life change, big transformations, but it'll come in a very infiltrating manner. Who you began this transit as will not be who you end up as when the 14 years is done, but you'll hardly see it happening. It'll happen so subtly and sort of imperceptibly, but it will happen. You're going to be a very different person and transformed completely by this transit. First of all, the 8th house has to do with death and rebirth, and as I've just said, transformation. So we tend to, with Neptune here, release the control of our desires and craving. It's a very desirous house, and so we let that go. We loosen the boundaries, if you like, on our desires and cravings, and because we do that, we find we have more inner freedom, more freedom to sort of feel authentically ourselves. That can be obviously really, really good. We might be freed from any long-standing personal boundary issues that we've had. You know, maybe you've been putting too many boundaries in place and not taking enough risks or not stepping out of your comfort zone, and your life is suffering because of it. In goes Neptune into the 8th house, and you can start to see those boundaries, those fetters, those chains falling away and freeing you, which is lovely. So we can have a lot of internal change. It's a house of change after all. A lot of growth of consciousness because of Neptune moving here, and a lot of psychic liberation as well. We start to get psychic hits. We might become claircognizant, clairaudient, clairsentient, and etc. We might suddenly find that we are much more in tune with the psychic realms than we ever have been before. Our values get purified now. This is a value house. It's actually the 8th house opposite our personal values. This is the more collective values of others that influence us. But because of this transit, Neptune opposing our house of values, there's a sort of a mixed brew, if you like, of this energy, and we find that our values get purified, become more spiritual, more genuine, more intuitive at this time. Now, I've mentioned letting go of desire, but it's even like a loss of desire that can happen with Neptune in the 8th, because we no longer egoically identify ourselves with what we desire. We don't need to have X, Y, Z in order to feel good about ourselves, in order to feel that we are valuable. Again, house of values. So we lose that need to have something in order to feel valuable to other people. That's what the 8th house is. It's this is our personal sense of self-worth in the 2nd. This is how valuable we feel to other people. And we can lose our egoic need to have stuff, to look a certain way, to have the right car, to have the right clothes and brands and blah, blah, blah. We can lose that now. Thank you, Neptune. Because we no longer have that egoic, attachment. Now, I said this is a house of death and rebirth, and if a literal death takes place in your life, not to you, but in the people that you love or know during this time, you will be deeply affected by it. It will hit you at a core level, hit you very deeply, maybe even shake up your own psychological understanding. If that occurs, be kind to yourself. Do be kind to yourself, knowing that it's the reason you will be taking things so hard is with Neptune in the 8th house. That's intensified. It's Neptune is an energy of longing, and in the house of hidden things, any longings that we have kept hidden, even from ourselves, they will surface over this 14-year period, and they will look to either be enacted, used, utilized in our life, or transformed and changed. So don't be surprised to see your longings becoming more real and more identifiable. Now, I don't want to go into this one too deeply. This is not a transit of death. But some people, because Neptune is escapism, in the house of death might see death as the ultimate escape. Death might appear to be the redeemer from life's harshness and life's sufferings. Now, you put 2 and 2 together there, and that can, for some people, spell certain things, but not for everyone. I want to point that out. You need other things going on in your chart for you to go down that road. You need probably a leaning that way in the first place in your chart, maybe a difficulty with depression or melancholy that might be present. And it's not, this transit alone is not sufficient enough to cause that to happen, but it can be a contributor. Usually when I am doing an assessment, I look for at least 3 influences in a certain area and on a certain topic. And then I know that the energy is strong and something to be, concerned about or to note. Otherwise, this on its own, not going to bring that about, but I do need to mention it just the same. We can feel very soul sick when Neptune's transiting the 8th, feeling as though we're in exile, in exile from humanity, wanting to go home. As a very Piscean person, and I've talked about this a lot through this series already, but as a very Piscean person, I feel this frequently, like I don't belong here on this planet. I feel like an absolute alien and a stranger, and I want to go home to whatever star I came from, and we all come from somewhere, but this longing to go home because we just don't gel, just don't fit. And Neptune in the 8th exacerbates those feelings. So don't be surprised if that is present strongly. And so bouts of melancholy can come because of Neptune here. But the design of this, the purpose behind this melancholic feeling or this longing to return home is to cleanse us of attachments, to release blockages to the soul. And then when we've released this attachment, like if we're longing to go home, we're completely detached from, needing to have, the Ferrari or the latest Chanel outfit or whatever. We've lost our attachment to the earthly realm. We just want to go. We're not engaged with having stuff and image and ego and stuff any longer, and we long to return to freedom and home, so to speak. And of course that then, as I said, releases blocks to the soul, become open, and that can be a good thing. Just keep in mind that it often comes with that melancholy, that sadness, that longing, that feeling of not belonging, and it's actually freeing our soul in the long term. Remember, I said in the beginning, this transit will change you completely, and this is part of the process in doing that. So if you're going through a bout of melancholy and you're in this transit, remind yourself that there is purpose in this madness, purpose in this feeling. And the purpose is, over a 14-year period, to free you. This is the catalyst for very deep life change. Now, it's also the house of crisis. And we become motivated by the needs of our soul now, and that might bring about a crisis in our life. No longer motivated by the material realm or whatever feels good on the surface of things. We're motivated by what the soul needs. And for some people, particularly materially oriented people, this can be very disconcerting. So heads up, if you're somebody who's very living in the earthly plane, it could be a big shake-up. Now, crisis can occur as a result of feeling lonely or feeling separate, and it doesn't have to be a crisis, oh my God, the house is burning down or whatever. No, it can be an internal existential crisis that you experience. Again, those feelings of melancholy and what have you can lead you into that existential crisis period. But you're not necessarily going to stay there. You are going to transform yourself through this process. And as I said, it's a result of feeling lonely and feeling separate, feeling helpless, not seeing a way out, even though ways out always exist. They do exist for everyone in every circumstance. I mean, you could be Andy Dufresne in prison and there is a way out. You are beyond your prison circumstances, if you've seen The Shawshank Redemption, and I hope everybody has. It's such a good movie. But as I said, there are always ways out. Now, the thing with Neptune in the 8th house is that you may not see the way out. You may not see the higher plane, the higher level. You might feel helpless, melancholy and sad, as I said, that triggers this existential crisis. But you know what? It's an excellent time for healing. It's an excellent time for therapy and any practice that releases you from obsession or paranoia or deep, intense jealousies and things like that. It's going to heal you from those experiences now. It's going to heal you from psychological limitations as well. As I said, keep the bigger picture in mind and know that there is purpose in this difficulty. Now, our sexuality is seen also from the 8th house. So when we've got this erotic planet, Neptune, moving through the house of sexuality, orgasm becomes a method of escape. Remember, Neptune is to escape the mundane, ordinary, everyday, and we can become quite hooked on the orgasmic experience because it helps us to tap out. We're no longer present in earthly reality any longer. We return to the divine through orgasm. So for some people, that might be the first time ever that they get to experience that feeling. So in that sense, this can be a positive transit for some people. Sexuality gives us a respite from our loneliness, and so we might be drawn to that for that purpose. We can lose our grasp on our personal desires and motivations in the sexual realm as well, and we sort of just want to bond and have oneness, and it's all about pleasing the other person and what satisfies them. Very compassionate and other oriented as Neptune is. And sex can be, like I said, an opportunity to serve other people, to serve others, to please others, and even to heal others. Neptune is a healing planet. And sex can be, the old Barry White number. Was it Barry White or Otis Redding? One of those guys. I've gone blank. But the sexual healing can come. So sometimes this transit can be associated with sexual inhibition, though. Sometimes it's associated with impotence in partners too. Particularly if we choose partners when Neptune's transiting the 8th house, we may find that we end up choosing partners who are not interested in sex or they're impotent in some way. And this is usually coming from our unconscious, that we do this to ourselves, to pick partners like that. It's an unconscious avoidance or an escape from our own vulnerabilities and our own fears when we do that. So, if you wind up with a partner or you're dating someone and they're not interested in that kind of thing, you've got to take a look at yourself and what are you projecting? What fears and insecurities about yourself do you have that's drawn in a partner like that during this Neptune transit? Now, the 8th house is about other people's money as well. And you know what? Inheritances can sometimes appear as if by magic. Neptune is the planet of magic. So in the positive, that looks really fun. That might not happen for everybody. You need to know your own personal chart and how it is lined up to be able to receive such a thing. But you might receive some sort of magical inheritance. You can discover even some hidden money now. Maybe you find that bank account that you set up when you were 16 and, oh my God, the interest in it's gone berserk and look at how much is there now and I forgot all about that. You might find a $100 bill in your coat pocket that you haven't worn since, 5 winters ago. That sort of thing. If you have harsh aspects to your Neptune in your natal chart, it can indicate maybe some losses of maybe an inheritance or a will, legacy or something, but usually through some sort of dishonesty or carelessness with hard aspects to your natal Neptune. Because your higher self is so engaged in all this soul growth we've been talking about with this transit, your interest in worldly matters like money may lessen. And so you might not have the willpower to, take your cousin to court over grandpa's legacy that was left to you and he wants to contest it. That could be a thing, but also you might experience some financial problems because of this sort of disinterest in worldly matters that occurs now when you're focused on your soul. So I want to, you don't want to come out the other side of this transit regretting, oh my God, they took all the money and I had nothing left and what have you. You want to try and keep focused, try and keep grounded. And if you can't, engage a good accountant to set up your finances and to manage your finances and so on for you during this transit. So if you're going into this period of your life, make sure you've got some good financial allies to help you, as you're going to be much more involved in the journey of your soul rather than practical matters. And let's face it, we need both. We need soul and spirit, and we need feet firmly planted on the ground to survive on earth well. So that's our little whiz through Neptune transiting the 8th house. I hope this helps you in your journey. This is not an easy house for Neptune to transit, as I said, but hopefully to be forewarned is forearmed, and this video helps you along the road.